Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Anisree Suresh, Research Associate at the Takshashila Institution, and today we have Anupam Manur, Professor of Economics at the Takshashila Institution, with us to discuss the latest developments in the Trump's trade policy. Welcome, Anupam.
Hey Annie, good to be here. As we were saying, I think Trump gives us a consistent and constant dose of material to work on. I wish I could say that that's a happy occasion, but it obviously isn't. It seems that this is so damaging to the world, what Trump has been doing as part of the U.S. administration, that you can't really, sit back and enjoy and say, it's something happening in the U.S. and we can laugh at them, unfortunately. I think what is happening now is going to affect pretty much every country. It's going to affect investors, it's going to affect consumers, it's going to affect, the US themselves, it's going to affect countries and companies and, every single thing that you can think of. I mean, it's not one particular act, but I'm saying this entire kind of Trump administration and what has been happening in the last 6-7 months is all kind of a recipe for disaster. But yeah, I'll let you kind of, I give the dramatic intro. You can tell people what exactly happened.
Yeah, I think we had discussed in some of the earlier episodes the Trump administration and his trade policy for his second term. And now we have a very interesting developments happening in Washington, especially with the recent verdict of the U.S. Court of International Trade, which has condemned the overreach of Trump's executive powers, ruling on a few of his illegal actions and halting their implementation. And a federal appeals court on May 29th paused the implementation of the Court of International Trade and allowed the government to continue collecting the tariff. The appeals court is yet to rule on anything, but for now they have put a pause on all the rulings from the Court of International Trade. So, Anupam, before we get into the details of what it means for India and the world, can we break this down further? Why the Trump administration's second term tariff strategy has been legally challenged?
Yeah, there's, I think, a lot that we can break down because there's a lot to analyze here, right? So first, let's start with what is this Court of International Trade. So there is the U.S. Court of International Trade was established, I think, under Article 3 of the Constitution. And this has nationwide jurisdiction over all forms of civil action arising out of the customs and international trade laws of the United States, right? So it's got a very clear mandate. And I think it's a small enough kind of court, a specialized court, has 3 members, 3 judge panels. And so this particular ruling at least was done, I don't know how many judges are there, but this particular ruling was done by a 3-judge panel, right? Yeah. So what is the main claim? They're saying that Trump has been using a legislation from the 1970s, and this is an emergency provision from the 1977 to be precise, which gives the president powers to basically put tariffs and other forms of trade barriers, right? Yeah. So the 1977 legislation is called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And from here on, we'll abbreviate it to IEEPA. So this IEEPA was invoked to basically put tariffs, right? Now, this IEEPA is basically an emergency provision, as I said, for national security purposes. So if the US is facing major national security threats, then the president can invoke this and then use and declare a national emergency. And then because it's a national emergency, you can impose tariffs or you can do a whole bunch of other things as well in terms of trade. It
grants the president a lot of authorities when it comes to economic actions.
Correct. So the main now contention, which the court is saying, and I think it makes abundant common sense for anybody on this planet Earth, is that, hey, where is the national emergency? Where is the threat to national security? There is none, right? Just because you have a trade deficit doesn't mean that it is a national emergency. It is not a threat to national security, right? Because the US, by the way, has been having trade deficits since the 1970s. I think in 1 or 2 years in the last 50 odd years they had a trade surplus, or maybe not even that. But apart from that, they've always had a trade deficit. So where is this idea of a national security concern coming from, right? So the court is basically saying you cannot use this kind of emergency legislation to pass trade laws. Right? It's unlawful.
Yeah.
What you should have done is if you have to do this lawfully, then basically they're not saying don't do tariffs, etc. They're not discussing or debating the merits and demerits of the tariff. They're just saying this has to be passed through the Congress, the US Congress, and only then is it lawful. You can't do executive orders under emergency provisions.
Yeah. To set a bit of a detailed context for our listeners, during the first term, Trump utilized the US trade laws to raise taxes on imports, citing national security concerns or violations of trading rules by the trading countries. So all these times they were utilizing the conventional trade law tools. However, these laws have much a lengthier implementation process, as it requires gathering evidence and soliciting public comment before imposing tariffs. However, unlike the first term, in the second term, you can see that Trump has used the International Emergency Economics Power Act. And a bit of a history of IEPA is that the US Congress initially passed this act in an attempt to restrict the emergency economic powers granted to the president under an old law called the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1970, which again gave the president expansive authority to regulate international transactions during wartime. I think President Nixon had used it in 1971 to impose a 10% universal tariff.
Yeah, you're right. And if I may take a further kind of deviation, as you'd probably expect me to do, there's very interesting kind of history and build up to all of this, right? I don't know how many of you would probably be interested in this, and I'm just boring you with these kind of details. But the 1960s obviously was a very, let's say, tumultuous time for the United States. They were engaged in, it was the height of the Cold War. They were engaged in a long and protracted kind of battle.
And you had the oil crisis.
The oil crisis, Vietnam War, there's a whole bunch of things are happening. And all of that essentially led to both political instability and economic, instability, economic slowdown, and a whole bunch of things, right? So they had to basically pump a lot of money into the wars. And that when you pump a lot of money into the wars, that would lead to inflation. Keep that fact on one end. The other important thing to remember of that time is that the entire world was on something called the Bretton Woods system, or the gold exchange system, which was that you could exchange 1 ounce of gold for $35. So if you paid $35 to the United States, you would get 1 ounce. Any central bank or a person could go up to the US Treasury and the Federal Reserve rather, and you can say, okay, here's $35, give me 1 ounce of gold, because that was the arrangement that everybody had done. It was a pegged system, right? And what happened was that because of increasing inflation in the 1960s, the dollar started depreciating. So all of the countries which had deposited their gold with the United States in exchange for dollars which were then used for trade, now suddenly felt shortchanged because now they have dollars which are depreciating. So many countries said, hey, I don't want this deal anymore. So you take back your dollars and give us back gold, because gold suddenly became more valuable than dollar, right? So you take back your dollars, give us back gold. So Nixon famously in 1971 said they feared that they would run out of gold very soon. And so they closed the gold window, the gold trading or a gold exchange window, and said that peg, which lasted for nearly from 1945 to 1971, they said that this peg would no longer be honored by the US. This was, by the way, a very big deal in monetary history of both the United States and the world, because we went to an entirely different system of currency and monetary policy, right? So now we went into a fiat system, which is that currency is valuable only because other people think it's valuable, and it's not backed by gold or anything of that sort. How does all of this tie in? At that point of time, because the dollar was depreciating and you had a whole bunch of the US economy was kind of stagnating, it was not doing very well. There was famously, again, in 1973, there was something called stagflation, which was the US economy was depressed, but you had high increasing inflation. So all of this happened at the same time. that also resulted in current account deficits. The trade, they were not competitive in the world, and so trade was falling. And at that point of time, they also imposed this particular 10% tariffs using the emergency powers, right? So this is, and remember, this is the Cold War setting, which meant trading with the enemy actually meant something. Unlike in 2025, there was actually a Cold War happening, right? So that's the context under which trading with the Enemy Act came under being, and then the IEPA was also under, which was rolled out. The alarming thing, Ani, is the fact that you're using a 1977 or 70s legislation in 2025, right? And for me, that is alarming because, Public Policy 101 for at least things like this will teach us that you need to have sunset clauses for many of these things, or at least, basically a due date, right? So you're saying if you're doing something in an emergency, when that emergency dies down, basically that law or those laws should stop existing, should stop being, enforceable, right? But clearly, the US has not been taking the GCPP or any of our courses where we teach these things.
Yeah, we recommend.
And so Trump basically has invoked a really old kind of legislation in 2025 and is doing this.
But I do kind of get the appeal of using IAPA. I mean, it's a fast process and does not require detailed reports from various departments, and it allows the president to impose tariffs whenever he wants. And I think that has been Trump's strategy: cook deals and hardline bargaining.
Yeah, so if they had to do this the proper way, then basically it would have to be approved by the US Congress, and that would be prone to long kind of discussions and scrutiny and so on, which Trump obviously wanted to avoid. So that Liberation Day tariffs, which was so there's a whole bunch of tariffs that Trump has put, right? Of which there is a separate set of tariffs on auto and auto parts, which we'll come to later. There's one entire separate things on maybe semiconductors and bunch of those things. There's one separate one on steel and aluminum. And then there is the base rate that is applied on all countries using that ridiculous formula. So for now, this particular court ruling is against only the one where, again, the Liberation Day tariffs, right? Which is that where, again, if many of you listeners remember, Trump came out and held that large cardboard chart with a bunch of countries and had a list of, numbers against each country to say what tariff rate, right? So this court has basically ruled against those particular set of tariffs, which means that the others are still at play, right?
I think it does not affect the steel, aluminum, automobiles, all this issued under the Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Act, which are legal.
Yeah. So what happened was that you have two main complainants against this. So you have something called, there's basically a set of small businesses that somebody, decided to do a joint action lawsuit on behalf of the small businesses. And they went and, appealed saying that this is harming our economic interests, right? Because the tariffs, all of these, let's say these small businesses were hurt by the tariffs because they were basically into the business of importing goods and either using that for production or reselling it to other parts of the economy, right? So since their businesses were directly affected by the tariffs, they decided to file a lawsuit saying this is not the proper way of doing things. Because again, if it was done properly in the Congress, they could have at least filed or made their displeasure known. They could have called the senators and said, hey, can you argue against this? And so on and so forth. Now, given that they were robbed of that choice or that particular process, they went to the court, right? The others is a set of states, right? So there are a certain set of a coalition of US state governments that went again to court because basically they also had a large number of, let's say, these businesses that were relying on imported goods, right? So that was the two set of complainants which went to the courts.
Yeah, and coming back to the separation of powers and the state of judiciary, I think that's a very interesting subtopic that we could take a lot of time to discuss and debate. And I think one of the major concern is that posed by the U.S. Court of International Trade was that, these powers, the emergency actions imposed by Trump, contradicts the separation of powers ensured by the United States Constitution. The Article 1 of the American Constitution states that Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes, and it also has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. But
Correct. So there are two really alarming things that have happened in the last 6 months, and even in Trump's first term, but a lot more, right, in these first 6 months or so. One is that the executive has clearly steamrolled the judiciary and the legislature. So many of the things that Trump has done, in his classic showy kind of manner, right? This complete ostentatious display where you have all the cameras and he's done his ridiculous long signature on these things and said, I've passed this law. All of those are executive orders.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, president just can't make laws like that, right? It's meant to be done by the parliament.
Powers.
Yes. Parliament or Congress, as they call it, right? So, but all of that has been sidestepped, and Trump has been using executive orders. Now, executive orders, by the way, for in most democracies at least, because Congress or Parliament would meet in particular time periods, and it doesn't function well 365 days a year, there is a provision for the cabinet or the executive to essentially pass laws until the Parliament can meet. Right?
Yeah.
Because, you sometimes you can't wait. And these are usually done for emergency things, right? So you can't, if there is something that requires an immediate kind of law and you can't wait for 2 months until the parliament sits, then, you can pass an executive order which will be in place for the 2 months until parliament sits, right? So Trump has been using this kind of mechanism to make a whole set of laws, right? So one that is just, as I said, steamrolling the legislature. So the legislature has taken a massive back foot. The second one, of course, is there is almost an open war that the Trump administration has declared against the judiciary. Right? So when this U.S. Court of International Trade, for example, made these comments saying it's illegal for you to do so, there's not the proper process and so on. One, there was very clear kind of lambasting of the judges. So not even of the court per se. They mentioned individual judges' names and said these are the people responsible. Now you're literally putting the lives of these judges at risk, right? Because given what has happened with January 6th, given the MAGA supporters and a whole bunch of things, I mean, we don't have to make a commentary about US democracy, but I think it is completely improper. I think any other part of the world, you would have a contempt of court case against the president, right? But in the US, of course, you have much greater freedom of speech, which is a nice thing, by the way. But you can't put the lives of people at risk, right? Which I think, whatever, in some way they're doing. But the idea that the courts in the US are open to such criticism is, I think it's something to think about, right? Of course, then that comes on top of the idea that, that there is clear political appointees of the court. So one of the things that have happened is that of the 3-judge panel, I think there are 2 Republican judges and 1 Democrat judge, right? And of which one of the Republican judge was appointed by Trump himself in the first term. So Trump has gone crazy about this, saying, I gave you this appointment and now you're going against me, blah, 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 and so on. Now, for most Indian listeners, when I say a Republican or a Democrat judge, it might seem completely ridiculous because at least in India, we don't have judges who are clearly politically biased. I mean, they are politically biased, but at least not officially politically biased, so they're more unofficially politically biased. So in the US, it seems that, you have this very clear kind of, you have a judge who's a Republican appointee, you have a judge who's a Democrat appointee, and they will then, make their judgments accordingly, right? So that for me, again, undermines the very kind of nature of the separation of powers and so on. So I think right now the executive seems to be a lot more powerful than the legislature or the judiciary. Complement this with what is happening across. So trade is only one of those factors, right? There are multiple other things happening simultaneously in the United States. For example, there are, I think, at least 180 different judicial rulings that have said that the White House has exceeded its constitutional mandate or authority or violated congressional statutes.
That's a
180 rulings,
number.
right? And that is the ones that the judges, or because there have been lawsuits and there are rulings. There are many more which have just passed. There are many more which are still undergoing investigations. It's just that the what do you say, the tactic or the strategy of the Trump administration is to completely overwhelm the system with so many executive orders that it's almost impossible for anybody to keep track of. The opposition party is completely in shambles. The judiciary is scampering. There are so many lawsuits. I don't know what is happening, right? So that seems to be the main kind of strategy, and it seems to be working because there's complete chaos at the borders. There's all of these ICE things that are happening. There are counter protests, a whole bunch of things about deportations and so on. Then there is the trade things. For example, on that particular morning, you don't know what tariff rate to apply. There are ships which are docked at the ports of the US and you don't know what rate of tariffs to apply. Is it 45%? Is it 25%? Is it 10%? Is it 0? Nobody knows because things are changing so quickly, right? We'll talk about what this uncertainty leads to, but this is the range of kind of problems that are occurring because of this. Final point, and I'll let you back into the conversation. But the final point is to show how the judiciary is kind of undermined, and probably it tells you about the complexity of lawmaking in the US, is that Peter Navarro, who's the economic advisor to Trump, has basically said, doesn't matter. Even if this court of appeal or all of this international court goes in one way, then they'll take it to the Supreme Court. If Supreme Court also decides against their favor, they've said they'll get it passed in any way, right? So Trump is absolutely determined. So I think this is a nice segue to the next bit, which is what can they do? Right? So if these things don't go their way, they have multiple alternatives lined up.
Yes. So, for instance, if the case reaches Supreme Court, like you said, so there are two scenarios here, right? Court could either allow Trump to continue collecting tariffs at 10% and different reciprocal tariffs post this 90-day period for negotiations and everything. Or it could say Trump's trade policies are an overreach of its powers and you crack down all these policies. So, in the second scenario, Trump can use many alternate legal mechanisms that all the former presidents have been using and which are already in place to reimpose the tariffs. So one of the highly plausible options is imposing up to 15% tariff for 150 days through Section 122 of the Trade Act, which allows immediate imposition of tariffs for a short term. And then you have another option of the use of Section 232, which is concerned with national security. And
so this is Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So, however, the caveat for the Section 232 is it again requires lengthy investigation, which is good because this is a law that comes with inherent constraints that allow okay, this is how you should put forward this kind of rules. And so that requires lengthy investigations and reviews by the Commerce Department, which might take months to complete.
But Ani, right now, the tariffs that are still in place, which was not a question by the International Court, which was on the cars, auto parts, steel and aluminium. They are under the Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, correct?
Yeah.
So that can again, and these are, the way, these are tariffs which are placed on, again, national security concerns, right?
Yes.
So you have to prove that there's a national security concern. Now, the fact that they were able to prove that they were importing too many cars as a national security concern, and they were able to do it quite easily, tells me that they can do the same thing for any other product on the planet. So, yes, I know you said that it comes with constraints and, the fact that it requires investigation, etc. But
there are ways to bypass
they've already passed many. And right now it's still in place. Auto parts and automobiles and steel and aluminium, all of that are still already in place using this particular thing. So, I think this is a viable alternative. I don't think it's as difficult as, the law makes it out to be. They have clearly backdoor channels under which they can pass.
And I think on a less serious note, I think one of the most extreme scenario that you could consider, Supreme Court revokes Trump's policies and Trump could play a victim card and say that I really tried my best and put the system, and the system doesn't allow me to change it and take the win and go back to pre-Trump tariff regimes. But I think I'm being extremely optimistic here. Likelihood is
So there's also the Section 301 of the US Trade Act of 1974 that they could call upon, and that particularly the US Trade Act of 1974 allows for tariffs to protect against unfair trade practices by other countries, right? And this is again a very easy one to evoke because that is exactly what Trump's claim is, that there is a lot of unfair trade practices, that other countries are putting a lot more, trade barriers, both tariff and non-tariff barriers
Yeah.
against US products. So they could easily invoke that. By the way, the special tariffs on China, which is up to the 245, 145%, etc.,
Now-
that is under this Section 301 of the US Trade Act, right?
Yeah.
So again, if they can do it on China, they can then extend
Yeah.
that argument to say, hey, India is also doing it, Vietnam is doing it, Europe is doing it, and so on. And so that is another proper option. The third option is that there is a trade law. If you thought, 1977 we spoke about, 1962 we spoke about, 1974, you're saying, no, that's all too recent. You can go back all the way to 1930, and there's a trade law from the 1930s that allowed the president to impose tariffs up to 50% on import from countries that discriminate against the United States.
Okay.
So that's another kind of provision. So they've got their alternatives very clear, right? There's a bunch of things that they can do, and they can do all of it simultaneously. Again, the system will get overwhelmed, and there will be this kind of trade uncertainty, policy uncertainty, and basically they can still continue to keep on collecting tariffs.
Yeah. I think that leads to my next question. I think it's pretty much clear, but just to reiterate, you think this will have any kind of impact on the negotiations that's happening right now, in the sense that any of this uncertainty that we discussed so far, do you think either it's going to dilute Trump's trade policy or it's going to make it more worse?
I don't know which precise direction it will go, but I think a lot of the negotiations will be on hold now. So I think this is a slight blow to Trump, obviously, because now every single trading partner, which let's say wanted to get a trade deal done with the US, will now just sit back and wait and watch and say, okay, what is happening, right? And they'll want to know the results of this entire episode before they make too big a concession to the US, right?
Yeah.
So, if you take India, for example, maybe India was ready to make a whole bunch of exemptions and concessions to US. But now they'll want to wait and watch and say, okay, let's see how this will play out.
Yeah.
Right? Let's see how this will play out. And so I think all trade negotiations will now be on pause. Remember, however, the more the pause there is now, the more we're going towards that end of the 90-day pause, which was done, right? So remember all the Liberation Day tariffs, where it was in effect for nearly, I think, a week or 10 days or something. And then Trump famously put a pause on that, which is, I think there's something called TACO. I don't know if you follow that. But TACO basically means that Trump will basically, will take something back, or there's a particular Trump always chickens out. That is what TACO is, okay? But in 10 days, he did chicken out because there was, the bond market went crazy, the stock market started falling.
The impact was really huge on the economy.
Right?
Yeah.
So after 10 days, basically Trump said, I'm going to put a 90-day pause on these, and this will allow all countries to come and negotiate with us, right? So at that point, maybe it was right that countries wanted to negotiate, wanted to use that window to negotiate. But now with this particular ruling, I think things will be set back, right?
Okay.
So I don't think countries will necessarily rush towards making concessions and getting into a trade deal with the US. Again, if there is no trade deal and if you have all of this, it's only going to add to the trade uncertainty.
So that if countries decide to continue negotiations with the US, they will have significantly more negotiating power than they did before? Do you think so?
Yeah, I think across the board, countries will have slightly more negotiating power because, you think about China, right?
Yeah.
China has been saying, all of these trade barriers are completely insane, that the US should not be doing it, etc. Now, every country will just point to the courts of the US itself and say, hey, your own courts are saying these are illegal. Right? Your own courts are saying these are illegal, so, how can you impose these tariffs? And I think that automatically takes away a little bit of leverage for the US and adds a little bit of leverage to all other countries, right?
The threat of tariffs may be impractical for the time being, I guess.
Yeah, they will still, it's not that Trump cares a lot about this. Trump will openly scold his own kind of judges and so on with other countries as well. So we don't know how all of that will go. But I'm just saying, in the balance of things, there might be slightly shifted towards the other countries on the negotiating table for now. But again, that is assuming that Trump wants to negotiate at all. He can still do things unilaterally and say, I don't care about any of these things. I'm just going to put 50% tariffs on all countries.
Yeah.
Nobody knows that, right? So the fact that nobody knows, I think, is the biggest victim and the biggest kind of result of all of this, right? The outcome of all of this is complete policy uncertainty. We don't know how the court cases will go. We don't know how, if they'll then use other kind of mechanisms to put back the tariffs. We don't know if countries are able to negotiate.
Yeah.
But amidst all of this, there's only one thing that we know, which is that uncertainty will rise.
Yeah.
Right. So there's one index of policy uncertainty, right? And this policy uncertainty, I think it's a group called policyuncertainty.com. Anybody can go check it out. It's fascinating. It captures kind of policy uncertainty within the US. It also captures global uncertainty and global trade uncertainty. So this global trade uncertainty they've been capturing since the 1980s, right? And it's an index, so it gives you a particular score. I want to give you an idea of how much uncertainty there is now, okay? This uncertainty score under, let's say, relatively normal circumstances in 2017 was about 80.
Okay.
Okay, the score was 80.
Yeah.
During COVID times, when obviously everything spiked, remember COVID times, there were shutdowns, ports were closed, there was all kinds of emergency acts which said that you can't export things, you can't import things, you didn't want to export, a whole bunch of things happening, right? This trade uncertainty score shot up from 80 to 1,400.
Oh.
This was during peak COVID.
Okay.
Can you guess how much it is now?
No idea.
Yeah.
I don't want to imagine, to be honest.
It's at 3,300 now. So that's to say that trade uncertainty under the Trump's administration is about 2 times or 1.5 times greater than peak COVID times. That should give you more than 1.5, right? So it was 1,400 then. Clearly more than two times, right?
Yeah.
So trade uncertainty is more than 200% greater than peak COVID. So that should tell you the kind of uncertainty this is causing and the kind of effect it will have on the global economy, right?
Yeah.
I want to put in maybe just some ideas of how this will play out. So one is that I try to look at literature. What does literature say about trade uncertainty, right? So there was one study which said that trade policy uncertainty reduced investment in the US itself by about 1.5% in 2018. So this was the first trade war, Trump's first trade war with China.
Yeah.
That reduced investment in the US by 1.5%. Now, I want to emphasize this. Yes, this is data for the US.
Yeah.
But if investment in the US decreases by 1.5%, imagine countries that are hit by it, which are much more fragile, let's say. The economies are much more fragile. So I would imagine that investment decisions on countries like India and many others will be much, much greater than the US, right? Another study basically says that uncertainty by itself, this kind of uncertainty by itself is equivalent to a tariff about, anywhere between 2 to 9%, right? Or 1.7 to 8.7% to be precise, right?
Yeah.
It's like an additional tariff. So on top of all the tariffs that exist, this trade uncertainty acts almost like an invisible tax on people, right? So imagine how this will play out. I mean, when you don't know whether basically you can trade with the country, what kind of tariff rate will be applied, etc. It's only going to cause a lot of delays in decision making.
Yeah.
Take the case of India now.
Yeah.
Let's say there's Apple, right? Apple has decided to invest in India. And Trump doesn't like the fact that Apple is investing in India because what he did was he put all of these tariffs on China so that Apple moves its base from China to the US. But Apple said we're going to invest in India, right? And then Trump has said anything that is exported from India will put all of these tariffs. And then they said that anyway, there's a whole bunch of tariffs that are there. They've then negotiated that, they've lobbied that, all of that, right? Now, Apple has still decided, okay, that they will invest in India. They braved the storm. But there would be thousands other smaller companies which, let's say, wanted to invest in any other country. It could be India, it could be Vietnam, it could be any other country, which would want to produce there and then export to the US or export to other countries. But with this level of trade uncertainty, you never know whether you'll actually be allowed to export. And that results in reduced investment. That results in actually reduced trade. You can see that would be on certain things, people would kind of buy more and keep. In certain other things, they'd say, okay, let me not just produce things because let all of this play out and I'm just going to, not produce anything, right? And that will be a dampener on the economic growth and so on and so forth. So I think this has massive repercussions on the entire world because all kinds of investment decisions, trade decisions will be just put on pause until there is greater clarity. And now it's been 7 months and we don't have clarity. And 7 months of lost business is huge opportunity cost.
Yes.
And all of this will lead to a recession in the US.
Yeah.
And I'm using will instead of might because it's increasingly looking like it might lead to a recession in the US. And if there is a recession in the US, again, that contagion will spread. Other countries will, invariably follow suit because there's, we're all tied together, we're bounded together by global trade and so on. So then it'll be like a house of cards or dominoes.
Yeah.
And we remember what happened in 2008. We're only even more tightly connected now, right? So if a recession in the US will spread, other countries will suffer. So it's massive. As I said, if it was not this serious, we could have laughed about it.
Yeah.
We could have laughed at Trump. We could have said, this is giving op-ed opportunities for Anisree, who, puts out 1 or 2 op-eds a week talking about Trump. But unfortunately, it's a lot more serious than that.
Thank you, Anupam. I think then I think a lot of things are going to happen again. We'll be back with more interesting and less scary topics, hopefully. But thank you, Anupam.
Thanks so much.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.